Right. So I've done another one of my little maps. I find them quite helpful to do actually. I did one a number of years ago, but I find them quite helpful because I'm not very good at remembering geography and where things are in the world and all that kind of thing. And it's interesting when you hear about a place like Ukraine and we hear about where the refugees are going to and stuff like that and the countries that border that. And it kind of makes you think, you know, in terms of just thinking about the world and where these things happen and that they happen in real places. And so when you draw a map like this, and this is a map of a good probably sort of 4,000 years ago now, of an area of the world where the life, as I said, I'm going to talk about Abraham and Sarah, where all of that took place. And I don't know if anyone sort of recognises this place. So this is the Mediterranean here, and this is where we would have Israel. It was then, it was called Canaan, and then down here is Egypt. Over here is modern day, this is Saudi Arabia. Here, you've got the green is the modern day names. You've got Iraq above that, Iran over here, Turkey up over there. So you've got kind of, that's where all this is taking place. And obviously those names weren't the names they had 4,000 years ago. But it helps just to kind of get a sense of where all this is taking place. I've got a nice little distance thing. It's all very approximate, I'll be honest. And some of it's not approximate, but you get the idea of it. Anyway, in terms of, does anyone know what this green, all of this is land, all of the white and the green, but anyone know what this sort of boomerang shape's called? Just out of curiosity, does anyone know what that's called? You might have heard of it. The Fertile Crescent? Yeah, it's few, well, one or two nods, yeah. Do you know what it means, the Fertile Crescent? Do you know what's called that? Yeah, the rivers are relevant to it, yeah. Because you can grow stuff there, yeah, that word fertile. And it means that you can grow stuff. And basically, it was important because in 4,000 years ago, in terms of the explosion or the development of civilizations, it was a place where lots of, it's called the cradle of civilization, a place where lots of stuff happened with lots of different nations. And one of them is, we're going to talk about, is the Israelites and the Hebrews and the Hebrew nation and where it comes from. And as I say, it was an area, this band here, of where all that sort of stuff happened. And it's got kind of, you know, there's a lot of history to it that we know about. So yeah, and you can see it's a kind of band, probably about 900 to 1,000 miles across, where all of this stuff happens. And these very key rivers, the Euphrates, the Nile and the Tigris, which basically made the land fertile. So that's why these nations all gathered around those rivers. Down here, if you know Saudi Arabia at all, if you've ever seen anything like that, you'll see it's all just out in desert, a lot of it, or whatever, apart from where the Saudis have irrigated it all with all their money and stuff, but effectively it's all kind of barren and desert-like down here. So yeah, so this all takes place here. So I've done my little map for you, just to help get a picture of where this is all taking place. And if you, could I just have a few volunteers? If you're a young person, young people, I've got a couple of people that would be helpers for me for a period of time. If you get bored, you can wander back to doing activity, but if anyone would like to be a helper, I could do with a couple of helpers. No. Anyone? Don't feel like you have to. Okay. So I'll have some adult helpers then. Okay, we'll need adult helpers then. Or older people helpers. Okay, can I have a couple of people that would be willing to read some scripture? Right, you don't need to read that yet. I'll give you a shout. Anyone else willing to read some scriptures? Thank you very much. Which one? Have I given you 12? Genesis 12? Yes, right, okay, right, thanks to Ray. Okay, so, right, so, Hebrews 11, that's what we're looking at. Hebrews 11 is a chapter that Jonathan introduced last week, and it's all about faith. And it starts with this line, it says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for, and certain of what we do not see. And he made the point last week that faith is that faith will only really show itself sometimes when it's being tested. That is when you know whether you can trust him, when you're being tested in it. But he also said that faith shows itself in the actions that we take. What we really trust is the things that we then go on and do. And he reminded us that all of the stories in Hebrews 11 about these people was really about illustrating what faith really looks like. So when we look at this story, we're thinking about what does faith look like. And Jonathan reminded us that Jesus is Lord. That is our sort of the ultimate reality, our unseen reality that we base all of our hopes on. Jesus is Lord. And that our true hope is in his return and our own resurrections. See, our faith all rests on who Jesus is. And that's what Hebrews has all been about. Who is Jesus and why you can put your faith and your trust in him. And faith means to wait patiently and not lose your hope in who Jesus is, no matter what you might be facing. And as I say, he or she goes on to write in Hebrews about all these people. But the problem is, if you don't know who these people are, the example doesn't really mean a lot to you. So part of what I'm going to do today is just pick one of these people and give us a bit of a story about their lives. But I want to start by saying, for us, who knows what, when I say, look, we need a bit of Dunkirk spirit, who knows what that means? Anyone know? Shout it out. What does Dunkirk spirit? We need a bit of Dunkirk spirit.
Resilience and the ability to survive.
Yeah, resilience and ability to survive. Who didn't know what that was? You didn't know, yeah, a few people didn't know, whatever. Why is it that? What is it? Why is it called that?
Because when they evacuated Dunkirk in 1940, I think, they had no enough ships, so they got all the people who got little boats to go across the Dunkirk and put all the soldiers on it and brought them back.
William, thank you. I knew you wouldn't let me down. yeah. Part of us knowing, when someone says something like that, part of us knowing what they're talking about is because we know the background to it. So it's really easy. And for the writer of this, who's writing to the Hebrews, when he says, faith, that if you look at Abraham and Sarah, for them, they would know instantly who they're talking about, because Abraham and Sarah were like the father and mother of their whole nation. So when they said, you want to be like that, they knew instantly who they were talking about. In the same way, if we know what's gone on in Dunkirk in our own history, we know what Dunkirk spirit is. So part of understanding and reading Hebrews 11 is to understand the stories behind the people in them. And that's what we're going to do today. So, this is about a husband and a wife. And we're going to start through it. And what we're going to see is that there's a lot of time involved in what goes on in their lives. So it's a whistle-stop tour of theirs. Basically, you can read about their lives all the way through Genesis, from Genesis 12 to 25. And Abraham is known as what's known as the father of the faithful, and he's also the father of the nation of the Hebrews, the Israelites. But actually, when you look at his life isn't one of unblemished faithfulness all the way through. There are times when we see him make big mistakes. But actually, as you look at his life, you also see that his faith does grow through the course of his life. And you see that at key moments in his life, he trusts and obeys God. And there are times when he cares about justice and fairness, and he's very loyal to members of his family, and at times he's really brave as well. But at other times you see him being a right coward, and he's a liar as well at times. So he's a real mix, but he grows in faithfulness. But also, when you read his story, what you actually notice is that actually it is far, far more about God's faithfulness to Abraham and Sarah than it is about his faithfulness. Abraham waxes and he wanes at times during his life, but at key moments he chooses to believe what God says and he acts upon it. And God is kind to him because he keeps restating what he said to him, and he builds on it. So he fleshes out these promises that he's made over his life, and he marks it out with signs to him, and gives him powerful images to help him think about what is he talking about, what are these promises. And the longer that Abraham walks with God, and Sarah walks with God, the more you see them grow in faith, and their weaknesses in character do seem to disappear. Anyone here got a pretty good knowledge of Abraham and Sarah? Put your hand up if you have. You're prepared to risk it. Jonathan, Therese, anyone else? Okay. Huh? Was that you, mate? No. Well, you can help me, because if I'm making mistakes, you can correct me if I've made a mistake in it. Right? So basically, let's start with the beginning in Abraham. Right? So what do we know about him? Well, first of all, he didn't start out as being called Abraham. He was called Abraham when he first started. And what we know about his first 75 years of marriage, first 75 years of life, are a few bits and pieces. So 75 years, we're going to just pop that there and hope it doesn't all collapse. So 75 years, right? And what do we know about him in his 75 years? Well, we know that he comes from a place called that's what it's called, and maybe it's a place called I don't know, but it's And what we know about him is that with his dad and all of his clan, all of the people, they travelled somewhere up, we don't know, we can suspect probably up this route or up this route, and he goes 500-600 miles and ends up just in the top bit around Syria, modern-day Syria, in a place called Mesopotamia, and it's in a place called Haran. And he ends up there with his dad and rest of his relatives and so forth. And they've got married, Sarah and Abraham, she's called Sarai and he's called Abraham at this point. And they get married at some point in that, but they can't have any children. So it's incredibly sad. She can't have children for some reason. And whilst that's really sad for us, and we think about perhaps we might know couples or heard of stories of couples that can't have children, it would have been that for them, but it would also have been quite scary as well, because your children are your retirement. So back then you didn't have social care, you didn't get put in a nursing home and the state funding that. You would have been reliant on your children to provide for you in your old age. So it would have been scary as well. And it possibly could have been a shameful thing as well. So it's a big deal. And for 75 years, they experienced that. And we don't know what Abraham was like in that time, or Sarai. I'm not saying that right, by the way, I never know if it's Sarai or not. But Abraham and Sarai, basically, we don't know what they're like. We don't know if they follow God, we don't know that, we don't know if they've got a relationship with God, we don't know if they're good people or lots of good people. But for 75 years, that's their life. And they end up here in this place called Haran with their family. And then God breaks into their lives. And if Therese, you've got Genesis 12 there, have you? Yeah, if you just read the first scripture there, that would be great, yeah.
The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you."
So God speaks to Abraham at this point, and speaks to him. And so he takes his family, he goes with his wife, Sarai, he goes with his nephews, and they end up travelling down to this land called Canaan, down here, which is there. Stay. And he arrives sometime, it would have taken, it's a good 300 something miles or whatever, it would have taken a little time to get there. And we now see, in this, we see that Abraham is in some sort of relationship with God. So at times, he looks out over the land that God has promised to him, or said, this is the land I will give you. And at some point in it, he will set up like little markers. You know, he don't have photos, things like that. He didn't have ways of remembering things. So they made little sort of, altars and things like that. That would be their way of marking things that happened to him. And at some point, we know he's worshipping God at this point in some way. So he's here. And then we've got 10 years of life now that we get in quite a lot of detail. Still no kids. Still no kids. But he's been told his promise. So I don't know, that must be kind of thinking something is going to happen there. Something's going to happen. But 10 years of his life. Okay. But there's a severe famine. So, in fact, because in those days they were so reliant on agriculture and pasture for all of their goods and produce and survival, there's a famine. So he travels down to Egypt. And he travels down here through this area here and into Egypt. And he's there for a time, we don't know how long, sometime within this 10-year period. And there, he's worried about, his wife is very beautiful, and he's worried about his wife getting taken off him and him being killed. So he makes up a lie and he says his wife's his sister, and he lies to Pharaoh, and God curses Pharaoh because of this lie. And then in the end, Pharaoh decides, finds out somehow, we don't know how really, and he boots him out. He sends Abraham and Sarai back up, and they work their way back up. But we don't know how long that is, but it's within this 10-year period. And during that time, when they're in this 10 years, his nephew, Lot, this is a hostile place. There are people here, there's lots of different warring, sort of city-states, and they're arguing and having, fallings out. And at some point, his nephew gets kidnapped. There's a fallout between a load of kings, 4 kings v 5 kings and their armies, and the nephew gets kidnapped in it all, and Abraham goes and courageously this time, so he's been a bit of a liar and a bit worried here, but then he's quite courageous, goes and loyal to his nephew, goes and rescues him, and what we find then is that when he does that, Abraham, all we know really about that victory that he has is he acknowledges God in it. He sees God's hand in his victory. We know that. For 10 years, still no children. And there are definite times when Abraham seems really confident in God. But there are also points when he gets to a crisis. And I don't know what you're like sometimes. I don't know if you're someone who sometimes mull over a crisis or something you're worried about, and it can go on for weeks and you're turning it over. Or sometimes you get that blind panic in the middle of the night and you wake up and something hits you and grips you. And Abraham somehow has one of these moments of crisis. And he says to God, when are we going to have children? When is this going to happen? This is in this 10-year period sometimes. When is this? When am I ever going to see, the promises that you promised me? And he's worried that actually someone else in his household will just inherit everything he's got, and he won't see this thing. And God speaks to him again, and this is actually the 3rd time that God speaks to him. And it's in Genesis 15. Therese, I think you've got that one as well. And God speaks again.
Abram said, "You have given me no children. So a servant in my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness.
So he gives, God fleshes out this promise again, a bit more now, a bit more about what is happening. And he says, and it's, they didn't have, back then they didn't have light pollution, so when you look up at the sky now, you don't hardly see anything. But if you've ever been in the countryside where you've got no light pollution, and you've got a clear night, and you look up at the stars, and you see the sky and the array of stars and that. Has anyone got a phone on? Does anyone just kind of Google how many stars approximately can you see on a clear night? Can someone Google that on their phone? Did you not? Someone just When you found it, let me know. But yeah, so it's a lot. It's a big number. Yeah. I'm sure Google will have an answer whether it's actually. Yeah. So anyway, so it's got this promise now. It's going to be from your own flesh and blood, and it's going to be. This is good. You know, you're going to have so many descendants, so many. And there's this important verse in it where Abraham believes God, and God says and credits it to him as righteousness. And it's a verse that comes up in the New Testament a lot around this faith, believing and trusting in God. And then God, but also in this time, God puts a time frame on this, and he says some shocking things as well. And one of the things he says is, your descendants for 400 years are going to be put in some sort of captivity before they inherit the land. 400 years. So roll back 400 years from today. What's 1622? What happened in 1622? Anyone got any guesses? Something from history in 1622. Rough. Come on. Something. Give me something. Never goes.
So it's 20 years apart from the gunpowder plot.
From the
Gunpowder plot.
That's a good one. So gunpowder plot.
We're heading for civil war.
Heading for civil war. Yeah, lovely. Thank you for the yeah. Shakespeare died 6 years earlier. So so we're talking about around that sort of time. So 400 years. These are big numbers. But anyway, it does seem to steady Abraham for a time. This promise of the stars. Have we got a number on that yet?
Yeah.
About 10,000 is what I saw.
About 2,000.
2,000 we've got. You've got 10,000. It's a lot. It's a lot. That's the point. It's a lot. Yeah. So anyway, so it seems to steady Abraham, but it all doesn't last for very long. And then something bad happens here. And this is really important, this story. Because what happens is, Sarai comes to Abraham and says, I don't know if this is ever going to happen. So why don't you take my maidservant and have a child through my maidservant? So why don't you do that? And then you will have this descendant. So in their impatience, Abraham and Sarai force the situation. And it's incredibly tragic for this lady Hagar, in terms of her life or whatever, incredibly sad. But this is now 10 years on, so we can look at this and think, oh, well, they shouldn't have done that. But still, it's 10 years on. Still, I've been waiting for 10 years. Who's 10 years old? We've got a 10-year-old. Esther's 11, yeah. So almost the whole of Esther's life. If she's 11. Is she 11? Lovely. So the whole of her life almost. So yeah. And sometimes impatience drives us to make decisions that step outside of God's plan. And this is one of those moments. And actually, but we've got to also remember, Sarai in all of this, there's no evidence that she ever heard these directly, so she's listening to what her husband said here, possibly. So, and her husband's been a bit of a liar to Pharaoh and put her in a pretty tricky situation down with Pharaoh. So we can be quite judgmental of Sarai and Abraham, but actually 10 years has passed, and also she may not have heard this for herself. She's trusting her husband, who can be a bit dodgy at times. So yeah. But as a human plan, without God, it causes all sorts of problems. And Hagar, and she has a baby boy called Ishmael, and they get kicked out. But I tell you what, it's also a story of God's graciousness. Because even though this is a human-made, impatient mistake by Abraham and Sarai, actually God hears the cry of Hagar. And God promises something to her, and promises some stuff to her as well. So it's an incredible story of God's grace in it as well. But still, time is passing. No child. Another bit of time passes. We're getting on a bit now. So this time, we've now got another 13 to 14 years. Anyone with dates going on? Abraham's now 99 years old. And God appears again to him, and God restates the promise to him in Genesis 17. Has anyone got Genesis 17? Do you want to read it out nice and loud, Andrew?
Do you want me to read out 19?
No, just 17, I think.
Okay, so you've got 17 and verse 19 together.
Oh yeah, no, read them both then. I'm not sure actually. But
Abram fell face down. God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be there." Then God said, "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant with his descendants after him."
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, you were supposed to read both. Yeah, so we've got this sort of name change that goes on now. It's a relaunch, whatever. We just put a 2.1 on the end. They changed their whole names in terms of identity, and Abraham becomes Abraham, father of nations, and Sarai becomes Sarah, mother of nations. Is he joking? Is God joking with us? He's changed our names and said we've got to change our names. I mean, how can you imagine going around? It's a bit like me turning up to a football match, like going to go and play football now, and going to the lads that I play football with. Yeah, I've changed my name to Ronaldo because, you know, I'm kind of quite good at this. That's what's going on here. It is a real sense of what is God doing? But they do take on board what God says. And not only that, God names the child that they're going to have, Isaac. And so at this point, God is sticking to his plan, he's sticking to his gun, but they don't yet have a child. So another year passes, and I don't think I've got the year one, but another year passes, and actually there's a promise that she gets the child within the year, and it all happens. And Sarah, beforehand though, when she hears all this, when she has the name change as well, she's laughing or thinking, this is a joke, this isn't going to happen. But actually Abraham says to her, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" In Genesis 18. Is anything too hard for the Lord? So this year passes, Isaac arrives, and Sarah now is laughing. We read she's laughing again, but this time she's joyous now, she's got her baby. We've got a child, Isaac, from Sarah, from Abraham. And the glimpse of this promise, is it being fulfilled? But it's not the end of the story for Abraham. 10 to 30 years pass. So we're getting, right, this isn't going to fall over. Right, 10 to 30 years. Right. So they're still living in tents, they're still in Canaan, but they're still living with people around them, so they haven't seen that part, and they're still in tents and all the rest of it. But 10 to 30 years pass. And Isaac, we know it's vague on numbers, there's some things we can guess about it. Isaac now, who's the boy, has grown up, this promised child has grown up, that God has said, you will have this child, you'll call him Isaac. He's growing up, we know he's a youngish, he's either a young teen or something, or he could be in his 20s, that's why it's a bit vague. Okay? And then you hear these words from God. This word in the Bible, it's what it says. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. I'll tell you what, that's not something I ever really want to hear. I don't like to hear when I'm going to have a test. I don't like it when I have to have my driving test. I don't like it when someone says you're going to have a test on your exams or whatever. I don't know what you're like, but for me that's really nerve-wracking if someone says you're going to have a test. Has someone done a driving test recently? Is it someone?
Just ask tomorrow.
You got your tomorrow? How are you feeling about that? Sorry, that's it. No, you haven't said. Yeah, it's a big deal, isn't it? But imagine someone says, God is now going to test you. And we don't know how old, as I say, Isaac was. We know he's old enough to carry a load of wood on his back. And we know that he's old enough to understand something of what's going on, because he asked a lot of questions in this experience. And last week, Jonathan mentioned a really important point about the Bible and having to wrestle with the Bible. And if you have ever read this account of what is going to happen, then if you're not wrestling with the Bible, then I suggest you're possibly not reading it right, because it's a big deal. It's quite troubling. So this is what God tells Abraham to do. Genesis 22:2, you got that?
Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountains of Mount.
So God says, take Isaac, the son that you've been waiting for 25 years. Well, no, it's now 35 years or whatever. The son who I've said, Isaac, the name of you, and take him and sacrifice him. I mean, it blows your mind. And it blows your mind because not only has God said this is the one who this is going to happen, but it also blows your mind because he says, it's not Abraham's not an indifferent father, he's one that loves his son. This is someone precious to him. And extraordinarily, Abraham, and I say there's all lots in this, but extraordinarily, Abraham just believes God and goes and does what God says. He gets up early the next morning. He takes Isaac off with him, and they go off and they go to the place that God has said for them to go. And we just don't know what's going on in Abraham's mind and emotions, but we can imagine. I would imagine. And Isaac must have been willing, because as we read the account, at first he's not so sure what's kind of going on, but actually as he gets on, we see he knows what's going on. He lies down, the wood that he's carrying is used, and he's tied, and he's put there ready to be sacrificed. And just as he's about to do it, an angel intervenes and stops him at that last minute. And like I said, there's loads of mystery in this story. But also, one of the things we've said about the Old Testament is it foreshadows what happens in the New. And one of the things that we notice is that where else do we see a father send a willing sacrifice of a son, and who carries wood on their back? And that is Jesus on the cross. That's where we see it. So something in this story foreshadows what God is going to do through his own son Jesus. And it's an unsettling story, it should be. And at the moment, I know of a US pastor who, along with his wife and 2 teenage daughters, is currently in Ukraine because they believe God has called them to do church planting there and serve that community. He's got him, his wife, and his 2 daughters in harm's way. I'm sure we've got to wrestle with this stuff, because otherwise we're not going to understand Jesus' words. And he that wants to save his life must lose it. If we understand anything about faith, then looking at these stories is important. So anyway, coming back. So Abraham and Sarah's death. So Sarah, she lives 137, and Abraham lives till 175. And in that time, we start to see Isaac get a family and stuff. But actually, we don't see him. He's still living in tents. He's still, living in this land. And he knows that for 400 years they're going to be taken out of that land. So he never sees the fullness of the blessings of nations. He sees these promises from afar, and yet he still trusts God for them. And so why have I told you that story? Because I'll tell you that because then, and I'm just aware of time, and I'm just wondering. I'm thinking I'm going to carry it on next week. Is that all right? Just because of time. So I think I'm going to carry it on. So next week, what we're going to look at is Hebrews 11, and the bit from Hebrews 11. Because I want to look at now what we're talking about. So this story of these people, this story of this couple, and their journey through years and years and years and years of waiting, and their story of not, faith that actually, at key moments, they make choices. And I'm gonna, as I say, I'm going to focus on it next week. But But I want to say this really on. I just want to finish with this on the American missionary couple and stuff, and the two teenagers. Because I want to mention this is real stuff. Just as this was real, 4,000 years ago, it's real stuff, real choices. They could have easily left from Ukraine. They wouldn't have had the feelings of other people. They could have exited from Ukraine. But their commanding officer, Jesus, said to them, this is where you are deployed to. This is where I've got you. And I wonder if we've got that same sense of calling to Bromsgrove, or Kidderminster, or wherever it is it's like now. Do we have that kind of calling to our workplaces, to our neighbours and to our schools? Do we have that same kind of calling to the annoying people in our lives, the ones that let us down or the ones that hurt us? Do we understand that Bromsgrove, like Abraham, was a temporary dwelling? He lived like a temporary resident there. Do we understand that Bromsgrove isn't our home? It's temporary deployment. And one day we will be called home to be with Jesus. And are we ready to be redeployed if he calls us to go somewhere else? Or it may be that God actually, like that couple, that family in Ukraine, it's not that they're called to go somewhere else. It's called that this is where God has set you. And even though war breaks out, you will stay. It's whether it's going or whether it's staying, it's having that same mentality of faith. And it's, if you try to hang, Jesus said it, he said, if you try to hang on to our lives, you'll lose them. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. Do we have the faith in the God of Abraham? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And God is gracious to us. He sees our weaknesses and he stays faithful to us. And as I say, this is a story about the faithfulness of Abraham and Sarah, but it's also a story fundamentally about the faithfulness of God, and it still is the story of the faithfulness of God in Abraham and Sarah's life and in our life. And that's where I'll leave it for this week, and we'll do maybe part 2 next week. Apologies that I went out of time. That was way over. Never do any interaction. It throws your word count out. Right, so we are done for today. Apologies, that was a half a talk, but I hope the overview of Abraham's and Sarah's life was at least a refresher or helpful introduction for the first time. Right, have you got anything?
Just one of the, I sort of briefly mentioned it, the worship group meeting this week. It's on Wednesday. Is that right, Pascal? Wednesday this week, 16th? Wednesday 16th. Where is that? Baptist Church. Baptist Church on Wednesdays. So if you don't have to be musical or whatever, if you just want to come and sit there and sing whatever you want, everyone's welcome. Not just the worship team. So 8 o'clock Baptist Church.
But probably help if you let Pascal know. It's probably helpful for her in terms of planning and stuff. So yeah, do all the messages. Brilliant, everyone. Have a lovely week.